The night of the final show, they stood 6 feet apart and sang in perfect harmony. The audience gave them a standing ovation that lasted 4 minutes. People in the third row were crying, and those two men, who had just produced what the critics called one of the most emotionally devastating farewell concerts in the history of popular music, did not speak a single word to each other once the curtain came down. Not backstage, not in the car, not in the years that followed. That was 1983. They would not share a stage again until 2003. And when they finally did, the audience assumed the silence had been healed. That time had done what time supposedly does, that two men who had built something extraordinary together had found their way back to each other. The journalists wrote it that way. The fans believed it. The promotional materials suggested a reunion born of reconciliation. None of that was true. Their names were Daniel Marsh and Peter Calloway. If you grew up in the 70s, you know those names the way you know the smell of a particular room from childhood. Without thinking, without trying, just there. Marsh and Calloway. 2 voices, 1 sound, 14 albums, 3 decades of tours across 4 continents. Sold out arenas from Brisbane to Birmingham. A Grammy in 1976. An honorary doctorate from the University of Edinburgh in 1981. Presented jointly to 2 men who had stopped being able to stand each other roughly 2 years before the ceremony. The doctorate was for contributions to contemporary folk music. They sat side by side on the stage at Edinburgh. Peter Calloway leaned slightly toward Daniel Marsh as the university chancellor spoke. He was not leaning out of affection. He was leaning because the microphone was on that side. This is where I want to begin, because I think it tells you more about what Marsh and Calloway actually were than any of the music does. They were performers. And the thing about performance is that it has no interest in the truth of what is happening off stage. It only asks, can you give me this right now, in front of these people? Can you make them believe? And both men, whatever their faults, whatever the war that had opened between them, could always answer yes to that question. They had been answering yes to it since they were 22 years old, standing in a pub in Sheffield with 2 acoustic guitars and absolutely no idea what they were building. Daniel Marsh grew up in Rotherham, in a house where music was treated the way most things were treated in that household, as something that happened elsewhere to other people. His father worked at the steelworks. His mother kept the house and sang Methodist hymns on Sunday mornings, not because she was especially devout, but because she had a good voice and liked the feeling of using it. Daniel inherited the voice. He did not inherit the willingness to confine it to Sunday mornings. By 16, he was playing guitar badly and writing songs that were, by his own later admission, genuinely terrible. But at least they were mine. He left school at 17, spent a year doing odd jobs, and arrived in Sheffield in the autumn of 1965 with 40 pounds, a second-hand Martin guitar, and the kind of confidence that, in retrospect, can only be explained by the fact that he had not yet been humiliated enough to know better. Peter Calloway came from a completely different direction. His father was a music teacher in Leeds. His mother had trained at the Royal College of Music and given it up when she married, a fact she mentioned rarely and felt constantly. Peter grew up in a house where music was not something that happened to other people. It was the furniture. It was the air. He could read music before he could read words. He played piano at 8, guitar at 11, and by 15 was harmonizing instinctively with whatever was playing on the radio, adjusting his pitch in real time, finding the note that completed the sound without ever having to think about where it was. The technical word for what Peter could do is sycophancy. That is not the right word. The technical word is musicianship, and it was so deep in him that it functioned less like a skill and more like a reflex. They met in November 1966 at an open mic night above a pub on Division Street in Sheffield. Daniel played first, 3 songs, 2 of which were, by the account of people who were there that night, genuinely good. Peter played second, 4 songs, all of them technically accomplished and almost completely inert. The landlord, a man named Ron Hutchins, who later claimed partial credit for what followed, put them in a room together afterward and told them, with the authority of someone who had seen a lot of disappointing musicians, that Daniel had the songs and Peter had the sound, and that they should probably figure out what that meant. What it meant took about 6 months to figure out. In those 6 months, they argued constantly, lived in adjacent rooms of the same grim bedsit, ate the same budget meals, played the same circuit of pubs and working men's clubs, and slowly, through friction and proximity and the kind of forced intimacy that only shared poverty produces, arrived at a thing that neither of them could have made alone. The early recordings don't exist, or if they do, nobody has found them. What survives is a set from 1968 recorded on a cassette machine at a folk club in Harrogate. 16 minutes of music. The tape is slightly warped and the levels are wrong, and you can hear someone coughing in the background at least 4 times. And even with all of that, the thing that comes through is undeniable. 2 voices that fit together the way 2 things fit together when they were made for it. When there is no gap and no negotiation, when the fit is so complete that the question of where one ends and the other begins stops being a question worth asking. That was what they had. It was also, eventually, what destroyed them. Because a sound that complete, a fit that tight, requires 2 people to stay in exactly the same place. And people don't do that. They change. They grow in different directions, toward different light, at different rates. And when a partnership is built not on flexibility, but on a specific, immovable chemistry, what happens when the chemistry shifts is not adaptation. It is fracture. The first real cracks appeared in 1974, though both men would later push the date further back. Their 4th album, Hillside Distances, was their commercial breakthrough. It went to number 3 in the UK charts. It sold over 1 million copies in the US by 1976, and the song that did it, the song that got played on every radio station and licensed for a car commercial and covered 17 times in the following decade, was called Morning Run. It was written entirely by Daniel Marsh. Peter's name is on it. It is on the record, in the liner notes, in the credits filed with the Performing Rights Society, Marsh and Calloway. Because that was the deal they had made at the beginning, in the naive generosity of people who do not yet know that success is a machine that changes the meaning of every prior agreement. Everything they wrote went out under the joint name. Everything they earned was split. Everything was shared, including the credit for things one of them had done alone. When Morning Run became what it became, Peter said very little. What he felt, he kept in the place where he kept most things. But the people around them began to notice something, a coolness, a precision in their interactions that had not been there before. The warmth that had always been unspoken between them, that had been legible in the way they moved on stage and the way they finished each other's musical sentences, began to have a different quality. It was still there. It was just effortful now. By 1977, they had a system. They did not discuss the system. It simply emerged, the way the rules of a cold household emerge, through accumulated small adjustments until everyone knows where the lines are without anyone having drawn them. They communicated through their manager, a methodical man named Gordon Healy, who had been with them since 1970 and who spent the next 6 years serving, without official title or additional compensation, as a kind of diplomatic channel between 2 men who had once been as close as brothers and were now conducting their professional relationship with the careful distance of estranged ones. Gordon Healy gave an interview in 2009, 2 years before he died, in which he described this period with a specificity that made clear it had never left him. He said the strangest thing was the music. He said that on stage and in the studio, they were exactly the same as they had always been. Better, even. There was a precision to their work in the late 70s that the earlier recordings don't have. He said he used to stand in the wings and watch them perform and feel something close to despair. because what he was watching was beautiful, and he knew better than anyone what it was costing them to produce it. What it was costing them was the pretense. Every night on stage was a performance within a performance. The music was real. The relationship it implied, the warmth, the ease, the two old friends who happened to make extraordinary music together, that was theater. And they were good enough at theater to make no one in the audience doubt it for a moment. The 1979 tour, which covered 31 cities across Europe and North America, is still discussed by people who were there. The Autumn Run tour. The set list was 2 hours long and they did not use a support act. By that point, their catalog was deep enough that they could build a night with nothing but their own material and leave the audience feeling they had been given too much rather than too little. There are bootleg recordings from that tour, particularly from the Manchester show in October, that circulate among serious collectors not just for the music, but for what they reveal about the technical achievement of what Marsh and Calloway were doing. Two human beings producing a sound that required absolute mutual attunement, while being, offstage, barely on speaking terms. The divorce, when it finally came, was triggered by a publishing dispute. The specifics are documented. Daniel Marsh had written a group of songs he intended to release as a solo record. Peter Calloway argued that under the terms of their original agreement, those songs belonged to Marsh and Calloway. Lawyers were involved. Statements were made that could not be unmade. There was a 3-hour meeting in a solicitor's office in London in the spring of 1982, at which, according to the account that Gordon Healy gave in his 2009 interview, both men sat on opposite sides of a table and spoke only through their respective representatives for the entire duration. They finished the tour they were already booked for. That was the 1983 farewell tour, 54 dates, ending at the Royal Albert Hall in London on the 14th of October. That night, that standing ovation, those 4 minutes of the audience on their feet, and then the curtain and the silence. The solo years were, for both of them, a complicated kind of freedom. Daniel released 3 albums between 1984 and 1991 that received strong critical notices and modest commercial returns. The reviews were generous but carried in almost every case a sentence or a paragraph that mentioned what was missing. One critic, writing in The Observer in 1986, described Daniel's second solo record as the sound of a man who has learned he cannot be whole. Daniel Marsh reportedly framed that review and put it on the wall of his studio. Whether as punishment or as motivation was never entirely clear. Peter's trajectory was different. He did not release a solo album. He produced other people's records, moved into session work, and eventually began composing music for film and television. He was very good at it. He won 2 BAFTA awards in the early 90s for scores that were admired for exactly the quality he had always possessed: the ability to find the sound that completed what was already there. He was, in other words, as a composer, doing what he had always done as a musician, making something whole out of something that needed him. Whether he found that ironic is not recorded. They were in the same room twice during the 20 years between the farewell tour and the reunion. Once at a music industry dinner in 1991, where they were seated at different tables and left within 20 minutes of each other, in that order. Once at Gordon Healy's funeral in 2011, where they stood on opposite sides of the grave and did not speak, and where the other mourners, most of whom knew the history, gave them both the courtesy of not expecting them to. The 2003 reunion was not their idea, it was the idea of a promoter named Alan Vance, who had made his reputation staging exactly these kinds of events. The careful reconstruction of something the audience had been told was over, sold back to them at premium ticket prices with the implicit promise that this time, whatever had been broken, it was fixed. Vance had been pursuing both men, separately, for 2 years. He had learned, through that pursuit, enough about the nature of their estrangement to know that reconciliation was not on offer. What he offered instead was something more honest, at least between himself and them. Not a reunion of friends, but a reunion of professionals, a business arrangement. They would rehearse separately and join for the actual performances. Their personal communication would go through Vance's office. They would not be required to pretend. What is remarkable is that both of them, on that basis, said yes. The rehearsal process, which lasted 6 weeks, was managed with a logistical precision that several of the musicians who participated in it later described as surreal. Daniel and Peter had separate rehearsal slots in the same building in North London. They did not overlap. Their notes about the arrangements were communicated via a shared document that both men contributed to without ever writing to each other directly. Observations, suggestions, decisions about which key to use, all rendered in the third person as if by people who were not present. The first verse should be taken slightly slower than the recorded version. The bridge in September Road works better without the second guitar. Agreed. The shows themselves sold out in 48 hours, 22 dates across the UK and Ireland. Then a North American leg. Then, because the appetite turned out to be larger than even Vance had estimated, a further run in Australia and New Zealand. 61 performances in total, every one of them, by the accounts of critics, audience members, and the musicians who played alongside them, extraordinary. Daniel Marsh gave an interview during the tour to a music journalist named Claire Forsyth, which was published in The Guardian in November 2003. Forsyth asked him directly whether this was a reconciliation. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "We are two musicians who are very good together. That part of it was never the problem." Forsyth asked what the problem had been. He said, "We haven't discussed it." She asked whether they planned to. He looked at her with an expression she described in her piece as patient and final, and said, "No." The tour ended in Auckland in March 2004. They did not play together again for 7 years. What happened between 2004 and 2011 in the private ledger of whatever Daniel Marsh and Peter Calloway felt about each other is genuinely unknown. There are no interviews that address it. There are no accounts from people close to them that illuminate it. What is known is that in 2010, Daniel Marsh was diagnosed with a heart condition that required surgery, and that during his recovery, which lasted several months, he wrote a group of new songs. And that in early 2011, before Gordon Healy's funeral, he called Peter Calloway. It was the first time they had spoken on the telephone in nearly 30 years. What was said in that call is not public knowledge. What followed it is a second reunion, smaller than the first, 8 dates at theater-scale venues rather than arenas. No promotional fanfare, no Alan Vance. The tickets went on sale with a week's notice. They sold out anyway. People who attended those 2011 shows described them differently from the 2003 tour. The sound was the same, or perhaps better. More pared back, less production around it, just two men and their guitars and the voices that had always fit together with that specific, unrepeatable completeness. But something else was different, and it is difficult for people to explain what. One audience member, writing on a music forum that has since been archived, said it felt like watching something that was almost finished grieving. She said she couldn't explain why she'd written that. She said she stood up to clap at the end and found herself crying without knowing exactly when she had started. Daniel Marsh died in April 2019. He was 74. The cause of death was the heart condition he had managed for 9 years. Peter Calloway did not attend the funeral. He issued a statement through his management that was 3 sentences long. The first sentence expressed condolences to Daniel's family. The second noted their long shared history. The third said that the music would remain. The statement was criticized by some people who felt it was cold. Other people, who understood more of the history, thought it was honest, and that honesty was what Daniel Marsh, in particular, would have recognized as the right form of tribute. There is a recording from the last of the 2011 shows at the Barbican in London in September of that year. It was made on a phone by someone in the audience and has been watched on various platforms several 100,000 times. The audio is not good, but what you can hear and what keeps people coming back to it is the last song of the night, Hillside Distances, the title track of the album that broke them, written by both of them, which was always true, whatever the later arguments about other songs. Two voices, and exactly as they always were. One carrying the melody, one finding the note beneath it that makes the melody complete. No gap between them, no negotiation. 53 years from the pub on Division Street in Sheffield, and the fit is still the same. The song ends. There is a pause before the applause begins, the kind of pause that only happens when an audience has been somewhere they did not expect to go. In that pause, if you listen carefully, you can hear one of them say something quietly to the other. The audio is too poor to make out words. You can hear only the tone, low, direct, not unkind. Then the applause, then nothing.